Elvis Presley, the king who changed the world. The darkness before dawn. The air hung heavy with winter cold on the morning of January 8, 1935, in a place most Americans would never have reason to visit. East Tupelo, Mississippi, was not just poor, it was desperately, crushingly poor. A collection of shotgun houses and dirt roads where the Great Depression had settled like a permanent fog. This was the roughest town in North Mississippi, a place where hope came in short supply, and dreams seemed like luxuries reserved for people in distant cities with paved streets and electric lights. In a two-room house on Old Saltillo Road, built by hand from borrowed lumber and desperate determination, a young woman named Gladys Presley screamed through the agony of childbirth. She was only 22 years old, but poverty and hard work had already etched lines into her face that made her look older. Her husband Vernon, just 19, paced outside in the cold darkness, helpless and terrified, as the woman he loved fought to bring their children into this unforgiving world. Yes, children. Gladys was carrying twins. The first baby arrived stillborn at 4 in the morning, a perfectly formed boy the parents would name Jesse Garon. The doctor, who had made the journey from town without any real hope of payment, wrapped the tiny body and set him aside. There was nothing to be done. In places like East Tupelo in 1935, infant mortality was simply another cruel fact of life, as common as hunger and just as inevitable. 35 minutes later, as if refusing to accept the night's tragedy, a second baby emerged. This one was breathing, crying, alive. They named him Elvis Aaron Presley, and from that moment forward, he would carry the weight of being both himself and the brother who never drew breath. Gladys would tell him throughout his childhood that he had the strength of two souls, that Jesse's spirit lived on through him. Some called it superstition, but for Elvis, it became truth. He would forever feel incomplete, searching for the missing piece of himself that died before dawn on that January morning. Safeguard, where Elvis entered the world, measured just over 300 square feet. 2 rooms, no electricity, no running water. Vernon had borrowed $180 from his employer to buy the lumber and build it with help from his father and brother. It was all they could afford, and even that modest investment would prove impossible to maintain. In the brutal arithmetic of Depression-era Mississippi, survival itself was a luxury, and the Presleys were barely surviving. Vernon worked whatever jobs he could find, loading hay, delivering milk, picking cotton, anything that might put food on the table. Gladys took in sewing and worked at the Tupelo Garment Center, her fingers moving constantly even as pregnancy exhausted her. They moved through their days in a fog of bone-deep weariness, young parents trying to keep their family fed in a world that seemed determined to break them. When Elvis was 3 years old, the fragile structure of their lives collapsed entirely. Vernon, desperate and foolish, altered a check from his employer, changing the amount from $4 to $14. It was a crime born of desperation, the act of a man who saw his wife and child going hungry and made a terrible choice. The law showed no mercy. Vernon Presley, along with 2 other men involved in the scheme, was sentenced to 3 years at Parchman Farm, the Mississippi State Penitentiary. For little Elvis, his father simply vanished. One day Vernon was there, lifting him up, making him laugh, and the next, he was gone. Family members would later recall the 3-year-old boy sitting on the front porch, day after day, crying his eyes out for his daddy. The trauma carved itself deep into Elvis's young psyche, creating wounds that would never fully heal. His fear of abandonment, his desperate need to keep loved ones close, his eventual inability to say no to people around him, all of it traced back to those terrible months when his father disappeared into the prison system and his world fell apart. Stabilized, Gladys and Elvis lost the house. They moved in with relatives, cramming into already crowded homes where they were charity cases, dependent on family kindness that came with strings of shame attached. Gladys worked harder than ever, taking whatever job she could find, But a single mother in 1930s Mississippi had few options and fewer prospects. She held her son close during those dark months, as if physical proximity could shield him from the cruelty of their circumstances. The bond between mother and son, already strong, became unbreakable. Elvis would later say his mother was his everything, and those who knew them understood it was literal truth, not sentiment. 8 months after his conviction, Vernon was released. The family reunited, but nothing would ever be quite the same. Trust had been shattered. Financial stability, always precarious, now seemed permanently out of reach. They moved from house to house in East Tupelo, never staying anywhere long, always one missed payment away from eviction. Elvis grew up understanding that home was temporary, that loss was always lurking, that the people you loved could be taken away without warning. In April 1936, when Elvis was just 15 months old, a tornado tore through Tupelo with apocalyptic fury. It was one of the deadliest tornadoes in American history, killing more than 200 people and leaving the city in ruins. The neighborhoods of Willis Heights and Gum Pond were virtually erased, homes reduced to splinters, families destroyed in minutes. The Presleys survived, but the devastation surrounded them. Elvis was too young to remember the storm itself, but he grew up in its aftermath, in a community that had looked into the face of annihilation and somehow found the strength to rebuild. That resilience, that stubborn refusal to surrender in the face of overwhelming hardship, became part of the cultural DNA of Tupelo. Elvis absorbed it without realizing, watching his neighbors pick up the pieces and start again, watching his mother work until she collapsed from exhaustion and then get up the next morning to work some more. He learned that survival meant endurance, that tomorrow might be better if you could just make it through today. The one constant light in the darkness was music. The Presley family attended the First Assembly of God Church, a Pentecostal congregation where services exploded with emotion and sound. Gospel music filled the small building, voices raised in ecstatic praise, bodies swaying and hands clapping, the congregation losing itself in religious fervor that was as much catharsis as worship. Elvis, from the time he was 2 years old, would slide off his mother's lap and run to the front of the church, standing among the singers, trying to join in, his small voice attempting to match the adult harmonies that soared around him. Gladys recalled that he was utterly fearless in those moments, transformed by the music, connected to something larger than the poverty and pain that defined their daily existence. In that church, among those voices, Elvis found the first hint of who he might become. The rhythm and emotion of gospel music seeped into his bones, became part of his musical foundation. Years later, when he was famous beyond measure, he would still say that gospel was his favorite music, the sound of home, the sound of hope in hopeless times. As Elvis grew older, he discovered other musical worlds. East Tupelo's poverty meant that black and white families lived in close proximity, unusual for the segregated South. Elvis absorbed the sounds of black bluesmen, the raw emotion and honest pain that poured from their music. He listened to country music on the radio, the stories of hardship and heartbreak that spoke directly to his own experience. All of these influences merged together in his young mind, creating a musical vocabulary that crossed the rigid racial boundaries of the 1930s South. He was a shy child, quiet and polite, close to his mother and often alone. Poverty marked him as different from the few children in East Tupelo whose families had slightly more. His clothes were worn, his opportunities limited. He learned early that the world judged you for circumstances beyond your control, that being poor made you invisible, or, worse, something to be mocked. But inside that quiet boy, something was stirring. When he listened to music, when he stood in that church trying to sing with the adults, when he heard the blues pouring from a neighbor's house, he felt something shift. The music reached past the poverty and the shame and the fear, touched something essential and true. It whispered that there might be another life, another way, another world beyond the dirt roads of East Tupelo. His parents saw it, too, though they couldn't name it. Gladys especially recognized that her son was different, that he felt things more deeply, that music moved him in ways it didn't move other children. She protected him fiercely, kept him close, tried to shield him from a world that seemed determined to crush the gentle and the poor. She told him he was special, that he had a purpose, that Jesse's spirit gave him double the strength and double the chance. Whether she believed it or simply needed him to believe it, those words took root. Elvis grew up feeling like he owed something to the universe, like he was living for two people, like he had to make something of himself, not just for his own sake, but for the brother who never got the chance. It was a heavy burden for a child to carry, but it also became his motivation, the fuel that would drive him forward when every logical reason told him to give up. By the time Elvis was 10 years old, his voice was starting to mature, and his love for music was undeniable. In 1945, his teacher at East Tupelo Consolidated School, impressed by his musical ability, entered him in a talent contest at the Mississippi-Alabama Fair and Dairy Show. Elvis, small for his age and dressed in clothes that announced his poverty, stood on a chair to reach the microphone and sang a song called Old Shep, a tearjerker about a boy and his dying dog. Confiscated, clear and emotional, held the audience. When the contest ended, Elvis had won 5th prize, earning $5 in ride tickets. It wasn't first place, but it was recognition, validation, proof that maybe his mother was right, that maybe he did have something special. More importantly, it was the first time Elvis Presley performed in front of a crowd, the first time he felt that electric connection between performer and audience, the first small taste of what would eventually consume his life. The next year, for his 11th birthday in January 1946, Elvis wanted a bicycle. He needed transportation, a way to escape the confines of East Tupelo, a symbol of freedom that every child craved. But bicycles cost money the Presleys didn't have, and Gladys, ever protective, worried her son would hurt himself racing around on 2 wheels. She convinced him to accept a guitar instead, purchased at the Tupelo Hardware Company for $12.95. It was one of the most significant purchases in American cultural history, though no one could have known it at the time. Elvis carried that guitar everywhere, taught himself to play by watching others and experimenting with chords, spent hours alone making music that no one else heard. At Milam Junior High School, he brought his guitar to class, played during lunch, sang gospel songs for classmates who alternated between being impressed and mocking him for playing trashy hillbilly music. The mockery stung, but it didn't stop him. If anything, it reinforced the lesson poverty had already taught him about being different, about not fitting into neat categories. He wasn't rich enough to be accepted by the respectable kids, but his love for music set him apart from most of the poor kids too. He existed in between, neither here nor there, forging his own path, because no existing path would have him. By 1947, Elvis had found a hero in Mississippi Slim, a local hillbilly singer who had a show on Tupelo's WELO radio station. Elvis listened religiously, absorbing Slim's style and sound. Through a friend, he got the chance to meet Slim and even appear on the radio show. He was scheduled to perform, but when the moment came, stage fright overwhelmed him. The shy boy who sang in church and played for his classmates froze when faced with the microphone, unable to make a sound. The next week, he tried again, and this time, he made it through. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Another small step toward the future that awaited. By 1948, the Presley family had exhausted their options in Tupelo. Vernon and Gladys talked constantly about starting over, about finding better opportunities, about giving their son a real chance at something more than the grinding poverty that had defined their lives. In November, they made the decision to leave. They packed everything they owned into a borrowed truck and drove north to Memphis, Tennessee. Affles was 13 years old, leaving behind the only home he had ever known, heading toward an unknown future in a city that seemed impossibly large and intimidating. As they drove away from East Tupelo, as the familiar landmarks disappeared behind them, Elvis made a silent promise to himself and to his parents. One day, somehow, he would make it. He would become somebody. He would buy his mama and daddy a Cadillac and a house where they would never have to worry about being evicted again. It seemed like an impossible dream for a poor boy from Mississippi with nothing but a $12 guitar and a voice that moved him more than it moved anyone else. But Elvis Aaron Presley, carrying the spirit of his stillborn twin and the hopes of his desperate parents, believed it could happen. He had to believe it, because belief was all they had. The darkness of East Tupelo was behind them, but the journey toward the light had only just begun. The first notes of destiny. Memphis, in 1948, was a different world from East Tupelo, but not different enough. The Presleys moved into a one-bedroom apartment in a public housing project at 572 Poplar Avenue, a complex for low-income families that was cleaner and more modern than anything they had known in Mississippi, but still unmistakably poor. They shared that single bedroom, 3 people cramped together, privacy a luxury they couldn't afford. Vernon found work where he could, never anything steady, always struggling. Gladys took whatever jobs came her way, her hands never still, her worry never far from the surface. Plunge, for Elvis, Memphis meant starting over again, the new kid in a new school where his poverty and his thick Mississippi accent marked him as an outsider. He enrolled at L.C. Humes High School, a massive building that held more students than had lived in all of East Tupelo. He drifted through the halls like a ghost, quiet and withdrawn, his guitar his only real companion. While other boys played sports and chased girls, Elvis spent his lunch breaks sitting alone, fingering chords and humming melodies only he could hear. The family moved frequently during those first Memphis years, always to slightly better apartments in the same rough neighborhoods, always chasing the illusion of stability that remained perpetually out of reach. Elvis grew up among black and white families living side by side in the projects, absorbing musical influences from every direction. He listened to the blues pouring from the clubs on Beale Street, country music on the radio, gospel groups at all-night singings at the Ellis Auditorium. Everything he heard became part of him, filtering through his consciousness, building towards something he couldn't yet define. He worked odd jobs to help his parents, ushering at a movie theater, cutting grass, doing whatever would bring in a few dollars. Money was always the enemy, always the source of stress, always in short supply. Elvis watched his mother age prematurely from worry and work, watched his father's shoulders slump under the weight of never being able to provide enough. The helplessness ate at him, fueled his determination to somehow, someday, change their circumstances. In the spring of 1953, Elvis graduated from Humes High School. There was no college in his future, no path to success through education. Instead, he took a job driving a truck for Crown Electric Company, delivering electrical supplies around Memphis for $41 a week. It was honest work, steady work, but it was also everything he didn't want to become. He saw himself at 30, still driving that truck, still living in poverty, still watching his parents struggle. The future stretched before him like a prison sentence, and music was the only key that might unlock a different door. In the summer of 1953, Elvis walked into the Memphis recording service at 706 Union Avenue. The small studio, run by a man named Sam Phillips, offered a service where anyone could record a few songs for a small fee. The official story was that Elvis wanted to record a birthday present for his mother, 2 songs pressed onto an acetate disc. But Marion Keisker, Phillips's assistant, would later remember that there was something more in the 18-year-old's eyes, something that suggested he knew exactly what he was doing and exactly what he hoped might happen. When Keisker asked what kind of singer he was, Elvis replied carefully. "He sang all kinds," he said. When she pushed him to name who he sounded like, he answered with words that would prove prophetic. He didn't sound like nobody, he insisted. It was both the truth and the dream, the statement of a young man who understood that imitation would never be enough, that to break through, he would have to be something entirely new. The day, old ballads that showed off his voice, but revealed nothing revolutionary. Keisker, intrigued despite herself, wrote down his name and contact information for Sam Phillips, along with her own assessment. "Good ballad singer," she wrote, and then added one more word that carried all the weight of her instinct. Hold. Backstage came of it immediately. Elvis returned to driving his truck, showing up at Crown Electric every morning, hauling supplies, collecting his meager paycheck, living the life that seemed to be his destiny. But he hadn't given up. In January 1954, he returned to the Memphis recording service and recorded 2 more songs, this time with Sam Phillips himself working the controls. Phillips listened with the ears of a man who had spent years searching for something he couldn't quite define, a sound that would bridge the unbridgeable gap between black and white music in the segregated South. Phillips had achieved some success recording black blues artists like Howlin' Wolf and B.B. King, but he knew those records would never cross over to white audiences, would never break through the rigid racial barriers that defined American music. He had said many times that if he could find a white man who had the Negro sound and the Negro feel, he could make $1 billion. It wasn't just about money, though Phillips certainly needed that. It was about the music itself, about the revolutionary potential of combining the raw emotional power of black rhythm and blues with the accessibility of white country music. When Phillips listened to Elvis that day in January, he heard something interesting but not yet extraordinary. The young man's voice had quality, but he was singing other people's songs in other people's styles, adding nothing new. Phillips took down his phone number anyway, filing it away with dozens of other hopefuls who passed through his studio, most of whom would never amount to anything. Months passed. Elvis kept driving his truck, kept dreaming his impossible dreams, kept believing against all evidence that something had to change. Then, in late June 1954, Sam Phillips called. He had a new song he thought might work for Elvis's voice, a ballad that needed the right interpretation. Would Elvis come to the studio and give it a try? On the evening of July 5, 1954, Elvis arrived at Sun Records, as the Memphis recording service was now called, to work with 2 musicians Phillips had recruited. Scotty Moore played guitar and Bill Black played bass, both experienced players who had agreed to give this unknown kid a chance. They worked through the ballad Phillips had in mind, running it over and over, but something wasn't clicking. The song was fine, Elvis's voice was good, but it all felt flat, uninspired, just another attempt at just another record that would sink without a trace. They took a break, exhausted and frustrated, the session feeling like a failure. And that's when everything changed. Elvis, his guard down, picked up his guitar and started fooling around with an old blues song he liked, a number called "That's All Right" by Arthur Crudup. He sped up the tempo, added a rhythmic bounce, sang it with a loose, playful energy that had nothing to do with the careful professionalism they had been attempting all evening. Scotty Moore heard it and jumped in, his guitar finding a complementary line that pushed the energy even higher. Bill Black slapped his bass with an enthusiasm that turned the instrument into a percussion element as much as a melodic one. The sound that emerged from that studio in those spontaneous minutes was like nothing that had been heard before. A fusion of country and blues and gospel that somehow transcended all 3, a new thing entirely, raw and energetic and undeniably compelling. Sam Phillips, listening from the control room, felt electricity run through him. This was it. This was what he had been searching for. He hit the record button and captured what would become known as the first rock and roll record, though no one called it that yet, because the term didn't exist. When the song ended, Phillips leaned out of the control room and spoke words that would echo through music history. "That was different," he said simply. "That was a pop song now. That's good." They recorded the song properly, then looked for a B-side. They found it in Bill Monroe's bluegrass standard, Blue Moon of Kentucky, which they completely reimagined, speeding up the tempo and adding the same rhythmic drive that had transformed That's All Right. When the session ended in the early hours of July 6, 1954, they had created something that would change American culture forever, though they couldn't possibly have known it at the time. Phillips pressed 5,000 copies of the single and started making phone calls, personally delivering records to radio stations around the South. When Memphis DJ Dewey Phillips played That's All Right on his Red Hot and Blue program on WHBQ radio, the response was immediate and overwhelming. The phone lines lit up with callers wanting to know who this singer was and where they could get the record. Dewey played the song 14 times that night, unable to move on because listeners wouldn't let him. The musical landscape had just shifted, though the tremor was still small, localized, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. A 19-year-old truck driver from Memphis had just invented a new sound, a revolutionary fusion that would eventually be called rockabilly, the foundation stone of rock and roll. Elvis Presley, the quiet boy from East Tupelo who had spent his childhood absorbing every kind of music he heard, had finally found his voice, and it sounded like nothing else in the world. Over the next 15 months at Sun Records, Elvis, Scotty, and Bill refined and expanded that sound, recording songs that captured the energy of that first night while exploring different emotional territories. They added drummer DJ Fontana to complete the quartet, creating a rhythm section that drove the music forward with relentless momentum. Songs like Baby Let's Play House and Mystery Train showcased Elvis's growing confidence and expanding range, his ability to shift from tender vulnerability to raw sensuality within a single performance. Pledged, but Sun Records was a tiny label with limited reach and even more limited resources. Sam Phillips, despite his belief in Elvis, couldn't provide the promotional muscle needed to break a regional artist into a national phenomenon. As Elvis's popularity grew across the South, as the crowds at his live shows became increasingly wild and the response increasingly fevered, it became clear that he had outgrown the small Memphis studio where he was born as an artist. Enter Colonel Tom Parker, a mysterious figure with a carnival barker's instincts and a manager's ruthless efficiency. Parker had heard about the young singer causing riots across the South, had watched the phenomenon grow, and had recognized something that Sam Phillips, for all his musical genius, couldn't provide. A path to real stardom, to national recognition, to the kind of success that transcended regional hits and jukebox plays. Parker negotiated with Phillips, pushing and prodding until a deal emerged. RCA Victor, one of the major labels with distribution channels that reached every corner of America, would buy Elvis's contract from Sun Records for $35,000, an enormous sum at the time and a record for a country music singer. It was November 21st, 1955, and Sam Phillips, who had discovered Elvis and shaped his sound, had to make an impossible choice. He needed the money desperately, but he was also selling away the artist who could have defined his career. Years later, Phillips would call it the worst business decision of his life, though he would also acknowledge it was the only decision he could have made. Elvis was heading for a stratosphere that Sun Records couldn't reach, and holding him back would have been both selfish and futile. The cosmic collision that had occurred in that small Memphis studio on July 5, 1954, had created a force too powerful to contain within the boundaries of a regional record label. For Elvis himself, the RCA deal represented validation beyond anything he had imagined when he walked into the Memphis recording service to record a birthday present for his mother. In less than 2 years, he had gone from truck driver to recording artist with a major label, from anonymous poverty to the edge of something extraordinary. The journey from East Tupelo to Memphis was complete, but a much longer, much stranger journey was about to begin. Who promised his parents he would buy them a Cadillac was about to become the phenomenon who would change American culture forever. The spark had been lit. The fire was about to rage. The hurricane arrives. The transformation happened so quickly that even Elvis struggled to comprehend it. On January 27, 1956, less than 3 months after signing with RCA Victor, his first single for the label was released. The song was called Heartbreak Hotel, and it was unlike anything mainstream America had heard before. Co-written by Mae Boren Axton and Tommy Durden, it told the story of loneliness and despair, with an echo-drenched production that felt both modern and haunting. Some at RCA thought it was too strange, too dark, too different from the Sun recordings that had attracted them to Elvis in the first place. Steve Scholes, the RCA producer who had championed Elvis's signing, recorded the song despite his own doubts, taking it on faith that the young man knew what he was doing. Within weeks, those doubts evaporated. Heartbreak Hotel climbed the charts with terrifying speed, eventually spending 8 weeks at #1 on the pop charts, 17 weeks at #1 on the country charts, and reaching #3 on the rhythm and blues charts. It was the first clear signal that Elvis Presley transcended categories, that his music appealed to audiences across the rigid boundaries that had always separated American popular music. The record's success opened doors that had been firmly closed to a poor boy from Memphis. On January 28, 1956, Elvis made his national television debut on Stage Show, a CBS program hosted by big band leaders Tommy and Jimmy Dorsey. Colonel Parker had secured 6 appearances on the show, enough to give America a sustained look at this new phenomenon. When Elvis walked onto that stage for the first time, 21 years old and dressed in a conservative suit, most of the national audience had never seen or heard of him. By the time he finished performing Shake, Rattle and Roll and I Got a Woman, shaking his legs and moving his body in ways that television audiences had never witnessed, everything changed. The screams from the teenage girls in the audience were so loud they nearly drowned out the music. The shocked expressions on older viewers' faces suggested they had just witnessed something scandalous, possibly dangerous, certainly inappropriate for family viewing. Elvis appeared 5 more with each appearance. The response intensified. Teenage America fell completely under his spell, while their parents and the cultural establishment reacted with horror. It wasn't just the music, though that was revolutionary enough. It was the performance, the physical movement, the open sexuality that Elvis brought to the stage. His hips swiveled, his legs shook, his entire body became an instrument of expression that suggested things nice people didn't discuss in polite company. In March 1956, RCA released Elvis's first album, simply titled Elvis Presley. It shot to #1 on the Billboard Pop Album chart and stayed there for 10 weeks. The first Elvis album sell over 1 million copies. At 21 years old, he had achieved more commercial success than most artists see in entire careers, and he was just getting started. Commuting came calling almost immediately. Elvis signed a 7-year movie contract with Paramount Pictures, the beginning of a film career that would eventually span 31 movies. His first role was in a western called Love Me Tender, filmed while he was still navigating the chaos of sudden fame. The movie's title song became another massive hit, proving that Elvis could sell records even from a film soundtrack. But it was his appearance on The Milton Berle Show on June 5, 1956, that ignited the true cultural firestorm. The show, broadcast from the deck of the USS Hancock in San Diego, featured Elvis performing his new single, Hound Dog, with an energy and physicality that made his previous performances seem restrained by comparison. At the song's end, he slowed down the tempo and performed what critics would describe as a bump and grind routine that sent the audience into absolute hysteria and sent moral guardians into apoplectic fury. The next morning, America woke up to a full-scale culture war. Jack Gould of the New York Times wrote that Elvis had no discernible singing ability and that his performance was sheer exhibitionism. John Crosby of the New York Herald Tribune called him unspeakably untalented and vulgar. Religious leaders denounced him from pulpits. The Parent-Teacher Association condemned rock and roll music as a corrupting force leading teenagers toward juvenile delinquency. Editorial writers across the country suggested that Elvis Presley represented everything wrong with modern youth culture, a threat to traditional values that needed to be stopped before the contagion spread. The controversy only made him bigger. Teenage America, already in love with Elvis, rallied around him even more fiercely, recognizing in the adult hysteria an admission that they had found something their parents couldn't control. Elvis became a symbol of generational rebellion, even though the young man himself was confused by the reaction. He had simply performed music the way it felt natural to him, moving his body the way the rhythm demanded. The fact that this was considered dangerous said more about 1950s American culture than it did about Elvis Presley. Colonel Parker, shrewd as always, recognized the publicity value of controversy and made sure Elvis appeared on every major television program that would have him. On July 1, 1956, Elvis appeared on The Steve Allen Show, where Allen, trying to tone down the controversy, dressed Elvis in a tuxedo and had him sing "Hound Dog" to an actual basset hound. Elvis hated every minute of it, feeling humiliated and neutered, but he maintained his professional composure. The show beat Ed Sullivan in the ratings that night, a fact that did not go unnoticed. Ed Sullivan, who had previously declared that Elvis would never appear by the way that they would feel, and else supposing on his show due to the performer's vulgarity, suddenly had a change of heart when confronted with the ratings numbers. He paid Elvis $50,000 for 3 appearances, the highest fee ever paid to a television performer at that time. When Elvis appeared for the first time on September 9, 1956, 60 million Americans tuned in, representing 82.6% of the television viewing audience. It was one of the most watched programs in the medium's young history. For his third and final appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show in January 1957, the network's censors made the decision that would become infamous in television history. Elvis was filmed only from the waist up, the cameras carefully avoiding any shots that might show his controversial hip movements. The censorship was intended to protect American morality, but it only added to Elvis's mystique, turning him into a figure so dangerous that television couldn't show his full body. Phosphate, in less than a year, Elvis Presley had gone from regional curiosity to the most famous entertainer in America, possibly the world. His records dominated the charts across multiple genres. His appearances on television broke ratings records. His concerts sold out instantly, with teenage girls weeping and fainting at the sight of him. He had achieved the kind of fame that creates its own gravitational field, warping everything around it. In August 1956, when Elvis performed in Jacksonville, Florida, a judge warned him that he would be arrested if he moved his body during the performance. Elvis took the stage and stood perfectly still, wiggling only his little finger in mockery of the restriction. The audience understood the joke and erupted anyway, proving that the phenomenon went beyond the physical performance, that Elvis himself had become the message. Meanwhile, back in Memphis, Vernon and Gladys Presley struggled to comprehend what had happened to their son. In March 1956, while Elvis was on tour, they moved from their modest apartment to a more substantial house at 1034 Audubon Drive. It was the nicest place they had ever lived, bought with Elvis's money, a tangible symbol that the poverty and evictions and desperate worry were finally over. Elvis had kept his childhood promise. He had, in fact, bought them a Cadillac. several Cadillacs, and a house, and financial security beyond anything they had imagined. But success came with costs that weren't immediately apparent. The quiet boy who had grown up in East Tupelo, who had been shy and withdrawn and close to his mother, was being consumed by a phenomenon he couldn't fully control. Colonel Parker managed every aspect of his career with an iron grip, making decisions that prioritized commercial success over artistic development. Elvis had no real say in which songs he recorded or which movies he made. He was the product, meticulously packaged and marketed, phenomenally successful, and increasingly isolated. Grand's mail arrived in sacks, thousands of letters, every week from teenage girls professing their love. Elvis tried to answer them at first, then had to hire secretaries to handle the volume. He couldn't go anywhere without being mobbed. Simple pleasures like going to a movie or eating in a restaurant became impossible. Fame erected walls around him, keeping the world at a distance while simultaneously demanding he give everything to that world. His fellow musicians, Scotty Moore and Bill Black, who had been there at the beginning, who had helped create the sound that made Elvis famous, found themselves increasingly marginalized by Parker's management. They were session musicians now, paid for their work but not partners in the enterprise. The camaraderie of those early days at Sun Records, when it was just three guys making revolutionary music in a tiny studio, became a distant memory. But in 1956, none of those complications seemed to matter. Elvis Presley was the biggest star in the world at age 21, having achieved in 12 months what most people don't achieve in a lifetime. From Heartbreak Hotel in January to the Ed Sullivan appearances in the fall, he had ridden a wave of success that seemed unstoppable, a cultural force that had changed American music and American culture in fundamental ways. The poor boy from Tupelo had promised to make something of himself, to lift his family out of poverty, to become somebody. He had done all of that and more, becoming not just somebody but a legend, not just successful but transformative. He had broken through every barrier, crossed every boundary, reached heights that seemed impossible. Yet as 1956 ended and 1957 began, with Elvis at the absolute peak of his early success, a letter was already being prepared that would change everything once again. The United States government was about to remind the biggest star in the world that he was also just another American citizen subject to the draft. The hurricane that was Elvis Presley in 1956 was about to collide with an immovable force, and the impact would reshape his career and his life in ways no one could predict. The dream had come true, but dreams, once realized, opened doors to rooms you never knew existed, some of them filled with light, others dark with shadows you can't escape. The draft. Duty calls the king. Predominant Graceland on December 20th, 1957. Elvis had purchased the mansion in March of that year for $100,000, a 23-acre estate with white columns and rolling lawns that stood as the ultimate symbol of how far he had traveled from the shotgun house in Tupelo. But all the success and all the money couldn't change what the envelope contained. A notice from the Memphis Draft Board classifying Elvis Aaron Presley 1A available for military service. The draft notice shouldn't have surprised anyone. Elvis had registered for selective service on January 19, 1953, 11 days after his 18th birthday, as all American men were required to do. But that had been during the Korean War, and by the time the Memphis Draft Board got around to his name, the war had ended and the urgency had faded. For 4 years he had gone about building his career, probably assuming, as many young men did, that he might simply age out of the draft pool without being called. Now, at the height of his fame, with his career exploding in every direction, the United States Army wanted him to trade his gold suits for khaki uniforms and spend 2 years as a regular soldier. The timing couldn't have been worse from a career standpoint. Or, viewed another way, the timing couldn't have been better for demonstrating that Elvis Presley was more than a performer, that he was a patriot willing to serve his country like any other American. Polo Parker immediately began calculating angles. the Pentagon offered Elvis the opportunity to join Special Services, a program that would allow him to entertain troops without undergoing regular military training. The Navy offered to create an Elvis Presley company, letting him serve alongside friends from Memphis. Both offers would have made his service easier, less disruptive to his career, more comfortable. Elvis, after discussing it with Parker, declined them all. He would serve as a regular soldier, undergo basic training, accept whatever assignment the Army gave him. "Taking any of these deals will make millions of Americans angry," Parker told him, and Elvis understood. He couldn't be seen as getting special treatment, couldn't appear to be avoiding the responsibilities that ordinary young men faced. His patriotism had to be real, not manufactured for publicity. Duty. Elvis genuinely believed in duty. His father had always paid his taxes and followed the law. Gladys had raised her son to be polite, respectful of authority, grateful for everything he had. The values of East Tupelo, however much Elvis had transcended that poverty materially, still lived inside him. When his country called, he would answer. He did request a deferment, but only to complete filming on King Creole, a Paramount picture that was already in production and represented his most serious dramatic role to date. The Memphis Draft Board granted the extension, and Elvis threw himself into the role with unusual intensity. He knew this might be his last chance to prove himself as an actor before 2 years away from the screen made Hollywood forget about him. King Creole would be his opportunity to show the world he was more than a phenomenon, that he had genuine talent worth preserving. The film, directed by Michael Curtiz and based on a Harold Robbins novel, told the story of a young man working in a New Orleans nightclub and getting pulled into the criminal underworld. Critics would later call it Elvis's finest dramatic performance, praising his natural screen presence and emotional authenticity. But when it was released in July 1958, Elvis would already be in uniform, unable to promote it, unable to capitalize on what might have been a turning point in his film career. March 24, 1958. Became known among Elvis fans as Black Monday. At 6:35 in the morning, Elvis reported to the Memphis Draft Board, accompanied by his parents and a group of family and friends. The media circus was massive, with photographers and reporters from around the world documenting every moment. Elvis, dressed conservatively and maintaining his composure despite the chaos, was sworn in along with 12 other recruits, and then bused to Kennedy Veterans Memorial Hospital for processing. From there, the new soldiers were transported to Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, where Elvis Presley, the phenomenon, would officially become Private Presley, serial number 533107761. The Army, with Colonel Parker's cooperation, staged an elaborate press event around Elvis's induction haircut. As military barbers prepared to cut away his carefully styled hair, Elvis faced the cameras and quipped, "Hair today, gone tomorrow." The moment was captured in photographs that would appear in newspapers worldwide. The king of rock and roll submitting to military authority, his famous locks falling to the floor. The symbolic power of that haircut cannot be overstated. Elvis's appearance, his pompadour and sideburns, had been as much a part of his identity as his voice. The haircut represented submission, transformation, the end of one phase and the beginning of another. American teenagers mourned as if something precious had been lost. Their parents, many of whom had been horrified by Elvis's influence on youth culture, felt a mixture of relief and vindication. The Army had tamed the wildness, domesticated the threat. But the reality was more complex than the symbolism. Elvis reported to Fort Hood, Texas, on March 28 for basic training with Company A, 2nd Medium Tank Battalion, 37th Armor. Despite the media attention that followed him everywhere, he was determined to prove himself as a soldier. He trained alongside other recruits, enduring the same physical demands, following the same orders, sleeping in the same barracks. His fellow soldiers, initially skeptical of the celebrity among them, gradually came to respect his genuine effort and lack of complaint. The army created headaches for its own leadership with Elvis's presence. Every movement required coordination at the highest levels to manage crowd control from swarming fans and press. At Fort Hood, up to 800 people would drive through the base daily, hoping for a glimpse of Private Presley in action. The distraction was immense, but the publicity value for the army was undeniable. Enlistment numbers increased during Elvis's service, and General Lewis B. Hershey, director of the Selective Service System, declared Elvis the best thing that has happened to the draft in 5 years. Sluggish in early June, Elvis received a 2-week leave and used the time to record several songs for RCA, stockpiling material that could be released during his absence. The strategy worked brilliantly. Between his induction in March 1958 and his discharge in March 1960, Elvis had 10 top 40 hits, including chart toppers like A Big Hunk of Love and Stuck on You. RCA also released compilation albums of his earlier work, keeping Elvis Presley a commercial presence even while the man himself was thousands of miles from the recording studio. But no amount of career planning could prepare Elvis for what happened in August 1958. During his basic training, Gladys Presley's health, never robust, deteriorated rapidly. She had been Elvis's anchor, the constant presence through every phase of his life, the person who loved him unconditionally before the world knew his name. Now she was suffering from hepatitis and liver problems, her body breaking down under stress and possibly alcoholism that had developed as she struggled to cope with her son's fame and her own sudden transformation from poverty to wealth. On August 12th, Elvis received emergency leave to visit his hospitalized mother in Memphis. He rushed to her side, staying with her constantly, but the situation was dire. On the morning of August 14th, 1958, Gladys Presley died of heart failure at the age of 46. Elvis was devastated in a way that would shape the rest of his life. He had lost his greatest champion, the person who had believed in him when he was nobody, who had protected him through the poverty and pain of his childhood. Cannons. At her funeral, Elvis was inconsolable, crying openly, throwing himself on her coffin, begging her not to leave him. Those who witnessed his grief understood that Gladys hadn't just been his mother. She had been his everything, the center around which his world revolved. Her death created a void that nothing would ever fill, a loss so profound that it would echo through every relationship and every decision for the rest of his life. He returned to Fort Hood in late August, hollow and changed. The army, to its credit, didn't push him. He completed his training and in September was promoted to private first class. Shortly afterward, he received orders for overseas deployment. Elvis Presley was being sent to West Germany, where he would serve with the 3rd Armored Division, the unit known as Spearhead. On September 22, 1958, Elvis boarded the USS Randall, a Navy transport ship, for the 8-day voyage to Germany. The deployment meant even greater distance from the world he had known, more isolation from his career and his life. But it also meant something else, an opportunity to process his grief away from the constant scrutiny, to be just a soldier among soldiers, to exist as something other than Elvis Presley, the phenomenon. In Germany, he was assigned to the 1st Battalion, 32nd Armor Regiment, 3rd Armored Division, stationed at Ray Barracks in Friedberg. His official military occupational specialty was 133.60, Armor Intelligence Specialist. Essentially, a scout who drove a jeep and gathered information. He lived off base with his father and grandmother in a rented house in Bad Nauheim, a small spa town near the military installation. It was in Germany, at a party on September 13, 1959, that Elvis met Priscilla Beaulieu, a 14-year-old girl whose stepfather was an Air Force officer stationed in the area. Elvis was 24, grieving his mother, lonely despite being surrounded by people, searching for connection in a foreign country. Priscilla, mature beyond her years and strikingly beautiful, represented something innocent and genuine in a world where everyone wanted something from him. Their relationship, which would eventually lead to marriage, began in that unlikely setting, an American icon and an American teenager finding each other thousands of miles from home. But in 1959, it was just a romance, a connection that made Elvis's German deployment less lonely, a relationship that his father and Colonel Parker viewed with cautious approval as long as it remained appropriate. During his time in Germany, Elvis served with genuine dedication. He participated in Winter Shield war games in Bavaria, led reconnaissance teams, earned the respect of his commanders and fellow soldiers. He was promoted to Specialist 4th Class, and then, on January 20th, 1960, to Sergeant. The promotions were earned, not given, because of his celebrity. The army had taken the king of rock and roll and made him into a soldier, and he had risen to meet the challenge. But Germany also introduced Elvis to something that would have devastating consequences for his health and his life. During maneuvers, a sergeant introduced him to amphetamines, stimulants that were commonly used by soldiers to stay alert during long operations. Elvis, who had never used recreational drugs and was actually opposed to the drug culture emerging in the late 1950s, accepted the pills as part of military life, a tool for doing his job better. The amphetamines gave him energy, helped him lose weight, made him feel sharper and more capable. What started as military necessity would eventually become dependency, the beginning of a relationship with prescription drugs that would spiral into addiction and ultimately contribute to his death. Irony was brutal. Elvis, who would later receive a special badge from President Nixon for his anti-drug work, who genuinely believed in staying away from illegal substances, became addicted to prescription medications that doctors assured him were safe. As his discharge date approached in early 1960, Elvis felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. He had served honorably, proven his patriotism, maintained his image as a respectful young man who valued duty over personal convenience. But 2 years away from the music industry was an eternity in the fast-moving world of popular culture. The Beatles were beginning to form in England. Rock and roll had continued to evolve in his absence. Would America still want Elvis Presley in 1960? Or had the world moved on? On March 2nd, 1960, Elvis left Germany for the last time. The next day, he arrived at McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey, where another massive press conference awaited. Nancy Sinatra, representing her father Frank, was there to greet him. So was actress Tina Louise, along with over 100 reporters and photographers. Colonel Parker had orchestrated the whole spectacle, ensuring that Elvis's return to America would be a major media event. On March 5, 1960, Elvis was officially discharged from active duty at Fort Dix, New Jersey. He had served 2 years, from March 24, 1958 to March 5, 1960, with good conduct and genuine dedication. The Army awarded him the Good Conduct Medal and sent him back to civilian life. Sergeant Elvis Presley became Elvis Presley again, free to reclaim his throne. The train ride from New Jersey to Memphis must have given him time to reflect on everything that had changed. He had entered the Army as a phenomenon at the peak of his initial success. He emerged as a man who had lost his mother, found discipline and purpose in military service, and grown up in ways that fame alone could never have forced. The boy from Tupelo was gone, replaced by a man who had experienced loss and duty and sacrifice. But the question remained, could he reclaim what he had left behind? Would the music industry still want him? Would teenage America, 2 years older and potentially fickle, still scream his name? As the train rolled through the American landscape, heading toward Memphis and whatever came next, Elvis Presley had to wonder if the hurricane could rage twice, or if lightning struck only once in a lifetime. Would reveal itself soon enough, but the path ahead was darker and more complicated than anyone could have imagined. The draft had interrupted his career, but it had saved him from the relentless grind of fame. Returning meant diving back into those waters, and this time, there would be no escape route waiting. The Gilded Cage of Hollywood. The first single after Elvis's discharge was called Stuck on You and it shot to #1 almost immediately, as if America had been holding its breath for 2 years, waiting for his return. The television special Welcome Home, Elvis, recorded before a live audience and broadcast by ABC in May 1960, drew enormous ratings and proved that his absence had only intensified the public's hunger. Frank Sinatra, who had once dismissed rock and roll as brutal and degenerate, hosted Elvis on his television special and treated him with respect bordering on deference. The king had returned, and his throne was waiting. Financially, that Colonel Tom Parker, that mysterious figure who managed every aspect of Elvis's career with iron control, had made decisions during the army years that would fundamentally alter the course of Elvis's artistic life. Parker had secured a deal with Hal Wallis and Paramount Pictures, then extended it and made similar arrangements with other studios. The contracts were extraordinarily lucrative, guaranteeing Elvis enormous sums for each film, but they came with a catch. The studios wanted Elvis in light, formulaic musicals, vehicles designed to showcase his personality and allow him to sing songs that could be sold on soundtrack albums. Artistic ambition was not part of the equation. Elvis, fresh from the discipline and structure of military service, followed Parker's guidance. The colonel had kept his career alive during the army years, had managed his money well, had positioned him for massive commercial success. If Parker said movies were the path forward, then Elvis would make movies. Besides, becoming a serious actor had always been a dream, and Hollywood represented glamour and respect in ways that rock and roll couldn't match in the early 1960s. The first post-army film, GI Blues, released in November 1960, was harmless and profitable. Elvis played a soldier stationed in Germany, a role that capitalized on his recent military service. The soundtrack album went to #1. Teenage girls still screamed at his image on screen. The film's success seemed to validate Parker's strategy. Blinked, GI Blues also established a pattern that would imprison Elvis for most of the decade. The films that followed, Blue Hawaii, Girls, 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 Viva Las Vegas, were all variations on the same theme. Elvis, as a charming young man in exotic locations, singing pleasant songs, courting pretty girls, resolving minor complications through wholesome humor and musical numbers. The plots were interchangeable, the characters indistinguishable, the artistic ambition non-existent. Some films worked better than others. Blue Hawaii, in 1961, became one of his biggest commercial successes, with a soundtrack album that stayed on the charts for nearly 2 years. Viva Las Vegas, in 1964, paired him with Anne Margaret in one of his most watchable performances, their chemistry undeniable, the musical numbers energetic and fun. King Creole, made before his army service, remained his strongest dramatic work, proving what he might have been capable of given better material and directors willing to push him. But those moments of quality were exceptions in a sea of mediocrity. For every Viva Las Vegas, there were 3 films like Kissin' Cousins or Harem Scarum or Clambake, movies so formulaic and uninspired that even Elvis's natural charisma couldn't save them. The scripts, which Parker negotiated without giving Elvis approval rights, prioritized soundtrack sales over storytelling. The songs, written by committee and chosen for commercial appeal rather than artistic merit, grew increasingly forgettable. Powerless knew it. His frustration mounted with each film, but he was locked into contracts that required him to make 3 pictures a year. The schedule was grueling. Filming for several months, then back to the recording studio to cut tracks for the next soundtrack, then back to the set for another movie. There was no time to tour, no time to reconnect with live audiences, no time to remember what had made him great in the first place. The British invasion of 1964, led by the Beatles, fundamentally changed popular music while Elvis was trapped in Hollywood. The Beatles had cited Elvis as a primary influence, had been inspired by his revolutionary fusion of musical styles, but by the mid-1960s, they had surpassed him in cultural relevance, pushing musical boundaries while Elvis sang forgettable songs in forgettable movies. The Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan, the Beach Boys, all of them were creating vital, contemporary music that spoke to the moment. Elvis Presley was making movies that could have been produced in any year, timeless only in their bland irrelevance. He watched it happen, aware of what he was losing, but unable to break free. Parker convinced him that movies were more prestigious than rock and roll, that film stardom would last longer than musical fame. The money certainly supported that argument. Elvis was making enormous sums from his film work, far more than he had made touring. But money, it turned out, was poor compensation for artistic integrity and cultural relevance. His personal life during this period was equally complex. Priscilla Beaulieu, the girl he had met in Germany, came to live with him at Graceland in 1963, ostensibly to finish her high school education in Memphis. The arrangement was unusual and controversial, a 28-year-old man living with a 17-year-old girl, but Elvis's fame and the Presley family's connections allowed it to happen. He genuinely cared for Priscilla, but his treatment of her was controlling and possessive, shaping her appearance and behavior to match his ideal vision of womanhood. On May 1st, 1967, they married in a private ceremony at the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas, followed by an elaborate press conference orchestrated by Colonel Parker. The wedding lasted 8 minutes. 9 months to the day later, on February 1st, 1968, their daughter Lisa Marie was born. Elvis was 33 years old, married with a child, a millionaire many times over, living in a mansion, commanding enormous fees for films that he increasingly despised. The success was hollow. He knew it. His friends knew it. Anyone paying attention could see that the man who had revolutionized American music in 1954 and dominated American culture in 1956 had been reduced to a parody of himself, making paint-by-numbers movies for paychecks that should have brought joy, but instead felt like compensation for selling his soul. Between 1960 and 1968, Elvis released only one album of non-soundtrack material, the gospel record How Great Thou Art, which won him a Grammy Award for Best Sacred Performance. Gospel remained his truest passion, the music that connected him to his childhood, to his mother's memory, to something pure and honest. But gospel albums didn't generate the profits that movie soundtracks did, so Parker discouraged him from pursuing that direction seriously. The pill use that had started in Germany grew worse during the Hollywood years. Elvis took amphetamines to maintain his energy through the brutal filming schedules, sleeping pills to come down from the stimulants, pain medication for various ailments. Doctors, eager to please a wealthy and famous patient, prescribed whatever he asked for. He never injected drugs, never used illegal substances, but his dependence on prescription medications deepened with each passing year. His weight fluctuated wildly as he struggled to maintain the physique that the camera demanded. The young man who had been naturally lean and energetic now fought constantly against his body's tendency to gain weight, using pills to lose pounds quickly before filming, then gaining them back during breaks. Food became another addiction, another way to fill the void that success had somehow created rather than satisfied. By 1968, Elvis had made 27 films in 8 years, and not one of them since King Creole had allowed him to demonstrate genuine dramatic ability. Critics had stopped taking him seriously as an actor. Teenage fans had grown up or moved on to artists who seemed more relevant to the turbulent 1960s. He was 32 years old, wealthy beyond measure, famous around the world, and absolutely miserable. "My career is in the toilet," he told Steve Binder, a television producer who would soon change everything. The admission was startling in its honesty, a crack in the facade that Elvis maintained for the public. But it was also true. The boy from Tupelo had dreamed of becoming somebody, and he had succeeded beyond imagination. But success had constructed a gilded cage, beautiful and comfortable and utterly imprisoning. The movies had made him rich. They had also made him irrelevant. The man who had invented rock and roll had become a relic, a symbol of an earlier, simpler time, while the world moved on without him. He was trapped by contracts and obligations and Colonel Parker's relentless pursuit of profit over artistry. The hurricane had been tamed, domesticated, reduced to a gentle breeze that generated revenue but inspired no one. Elvis Presley needed a miracle, a chance to prove that the fire still burned beneath the ashes of commercial compromise. He needed to remember who he had been before the movies and the pills and the endless string of forgettable soundtracks. He needed to find his way back to the music that had started it all, to the raw power and revolutionary spirit that had changed American culture in a single night at Sun Records. Incorporates was coming, though he didn't know it yet. Sometimes salvation arrives disguised as another television special, another obligation in an endless series of obligations. Sometimes the path home is hidden until you're so lost that you have no choice but to trust a stranger who tells you the brutal truth. The gilded cage was about to open, but first, Elvis Presley would have to admit that he was imprisoned. The comeback, reclaiming the throne. Prerequisite: in early 1968, Colonel Tom Parker negotiated yet another deal, this one with NBC Television. The network wanted an Elvis Presley Christmas special, a wholesome hour of holiday music with Elvis in a cardigan sweater, perhaps sitting by a fireplace, singing traditional carols. It seemed like another safe commercial product in an endless string of safe commercial products. Parker agreed to the concept because it came with a substantial paycheck, $1 million for Elvis's participation. But Bob Finkel, the NBC producer assigned to the project, saw something different. He recognized that the Christmas special concept was creatively bankrupt, that it would do nothing to revitalize Elvis's career or reconnect him with contemporary audiences. More importantly, Finkel could see in Elvis's eyes the frustration and hunger for something more. He brought in Steve Binder, a young director who had experience with music programming and, crucially, a rebellious streak that might help Elvis break free from Parker's control, at least temporarily. Elvis in May 1968, he asked a direct question that cut through all the Hollywood polish and public relations. "What do you think of your career?" Elvis could have deflected, could have maintained the fiction that everything was going well. Instead, after looking at Binder for a long moment, he gave an honest answer. He thought his career was over, he said. The world had moved on. The Beatles and the British invasion had made him yesterday's news. Binder's response was even more direct. "Your career is in the toilet," he told Elvis. Finally, Elvis thought, finally someone was speaking truth. The two men talked for hours that day, Binder sketching out a vision for something completely different from the Christmas special Parker had envisioned. Instead of wholesome holiday songs, what if Elvis went back to his roots? What if he performed the music that had made him great in the first place, raw and honest and dangerous? What if, instead of trying to be safe and commercial, he took a risk? Elvis's response was immediate and powerful. He wanted to do it. He was tired of the movies, tired of the soundtrack albums, tired of being a shadow of himself. If this special was going to be his last chance to prove he still mattered, then he wanted it to be real. Penserve objected strenuously when he learned about Binder's plans. But by then, production was underway, and Elvis was energized in a way he hadn't been in years. They filmed over several days in late June at NBC's Burbank studios, creating multiple segments that showcased different aspects of Elvis's talent. The centerpiece was an intimate sit-down segment, Elvis in black leather, surrounded by a small audience and backed only by acoustic guitars, performing songs from his early catalog with a looseness and joy that had been absent from his work for a decade. Between black leather outfits, deliberate choice to make Elvis look dangerous again, to recapture the rebel spirit that had made him famous. When he walked onto the stage for the sit-down taping, Elvis was terrified. He hadn't performed in front of a live audience in 7 years. His hands were shaking, his throat was dry. He wasn't sure he could do it anymore, wasn't sure the magic was still there. But then he started playing, started singing, started connecting with the audience in that electric way that had always been his greatest gift. The fear evaporated. The rust fell away. Elvis Presley, the performer who had changed American culture, was still in there. And when given the chance, he roared back to life. The sit-down segments captured something raw and vital. Elvis at his most natural and authentic, laughing with his old friends Scotty Moore and DJ Fontana, telling stories, making jokes, completely at ease in a way he never seemed in his movies. The special also included elaborate production numbers, choreographed segments that showed Elvis's showmanship and physical presence. But the magic was in those intimate moments, in the black leather and the acoustic guitar, and the pure joy of making music without the constraints of Hollywood formulas. Near the end of the special, Elvis performed If I Can Dream, a powerful ballad written specifically for the show that addressed the social turmoil of 1968, the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy, the sense that America was tearing itself apart. The song was ambitious and socially conscious in a way that Elvis's material hadn't been in years. He poured everything into the performance, his voice building to a climax that demonstrated his vocal power remained undiminished. Parker managed to insist on including Blue Christmas to give the special at least a token holiday element. But otherwise, Binder's vision prevailed. The show, officially titled Singer Presents Elvis, after the sewing machine company that sponsored it, aired on NBC on December 3, 1968. It captured 42% of the television audience that night, making it the most-watched television special of the season. But more important than the ratings was the reaction. Critics who had written Elvis off as irrelevant suddenly remembered why he had been revolutionary in the first place. John Landau of I magazine wrote words that captured the emotional power of what audiences had witnessed. There is something magical about watching a man who has lost himself find his way back home. He sang with the kind of power people no longer expect of rock and roll singers. Elvis himself felt something fundamental shift. The special reminded him of who he was beyond the movies and the money, reconnected him with the raw power of live performance, the immediacy of connecting with an audience. During the taping, he had called Parker to his dressing room and told him he wanted to tour again, wanted to get back on stage and perform for real audiences. Parker announced it as a comeback tour, a phrase Elvis hated because it implied he had been away, had been a has-been. But the sentiment was correct. Elvis Presley was coming back. The commercial success of the special gave him leverage he hadn't had in years. In January 1969, he returned to a recording studio for the first time since his last soundtrack session, working with producer Chips Moman at American Sound Studio in Memphis. The sessions were revelatory. Moman pushed Elvis to dig deeper emotionally, to connect with material that had substance and meaning. The result was some of the best work of Elvis's career. In the Ghetto, released in April 1969, reached number 3 on the pop charts and became one of his signature songs, a socially conscious narrative about poverty and violence that demonstrated Elvis could be relevant to contemporary issues. Suspicious Minds, released in August, became his first number 1 hit in 7 years, a powerful performance that showcased both his vocal ability and his emotional depth. The album, From Elvis in Memphis, proved he could still make vital contemporary music when given the chance. But the real test would be live performance. In July 1969, Elvis opened a month-long engagement at the International Hotel in Las Vegas, his first major concert appearance since 1961. The pressure was enormous. Las Vegas was notorious for destroying careers as often as it made them. If Elvis couldn't deliver, if the magic wasn't there, the comeback would end as quickly as it had begun. Unauthorized, July 31st, 1969, Elvis was almost sick with nervousness. His bass player, Jerry Sheff, recalled that Elvis's leg was going 1,000,000 miles an hour, that his hands were drumming constantly, that the fear was palpable. 8 years away from the concert stage felt like a lifetime. The audience that first night included numerous celebrities, industry people who could make or break the engagement with their reactions. When Elvis and his band finished their first song, the place exploded. The audience's enthusiasm was overwhelming, genuine, ecstatic. Elvis felt the tension drain from his body as he realized they still loved him, that the connection was still there. Over the next 4 weeks, he performed 57 shows for over 100,000 people, breaking every attendance record Las Vegas had ever seen. Every show sold out immediately. The reviews were rapturous. Elvis in Las Vegas wasn't the rebel of 1956, and he wasn't trying to be. He was a mature performer, confident and commanding, delivering shows that were meticulously staged, yet felt spontaneous and exciting. He wore elaborate jumpsuits designed by Bill Ballou, costumes that were theatrical without being costumes, that allowed him to move freely while making him look like the star he was. His band was large and professional, capable of handling everything from rock and roll to gospel to ballads. Formulation in Las Vegas led to touring, the first real tour Elvis had undertaken since the 1950s. In 1970, he performed over 100 concerts across the country, every show a sellout, every audience responding with the same enthusiasm he had received in Vegas. The phenomenon was back, but this time it was sustainable, built on genuine talent and professional excellence rather than teenage hysteria. On January 14, 1973, Elvis performed at the Honolulu International Center for a concert that would be broadcast globally via satellite. Aloha from Hawaii became the first entertainment special to be seen worldwide, reaching over 1 billion people across 40 countries. Elvis wore a white jumpsuit decorated with an American eagle, a visual symbol of his status as an American icon. The performance was powerful and professional, showcasing Elvis at the peak of his comeback. But the comeback, for all its commercial success and artistic validation, came with costs that weren't immediately apparent. The touring schedule was brutal. Dozens of shows every month, constantly moving from city to city, living in hotels, never having time to rest or recover. Elvis's dependence on prescription medications increased to help him maintain the pace. He took stimulants to give him energy for the shows, sleeping pills to come down afterward, pain medication for various ailments, real and imagined. The Las Vegas residencies, which eventually numbered over 700 shows between 1969 and 1976, became a grind that wore him down physically and mentally. The same songs every night, the same staging, the same jokes. What had started as liberation became another form of imprisonment, different from the Hollywood years, but equally exhausting. His marriage to Priscilla, which had been strained by his movie-making years, couldn't survive the touring years. Elvis's infidelities, his controlling behavior, the prescription drug use that was accelerating, all contributed to the breakdown. They separated in February 1972, and their divorce was finalized on October 9, 1973. They remained friends and co-parents to Lisa Marie, maintaining a relationship that was warmer after divorce than it had been during the final years of their marriage. The comeback that began with the 1968 television special and reached its peak with Aloha from Hawaii in 1973 had proven that Elvis Presley still mattered, that his talent remained formidable, that his connection with audiences transcended the commercial compromises of the 1960s. He had reclaimed his throne, re-established himself as one of the greatest performers in American music history. But the throne, it turned out, was a prison of its own. The same touring schedule that proved his relevance was destroying his health. The same Las Vegas shows that generated enormous revenue were grinding away at his spirit. The prescription drugs that allowed him to maintain the pace were slowly poisoning his body. The comeback was real, but its costs were mounting with every show, every pill, every sleepless night in another hotel room in another city, where thousands of people waited to see the king perform one more time. Elvis Presley had found his way back home, just as that critic had written in 1968. But home, it turned out, was more complicated and dangerous than anyone had realized. The fire that had been rekindled was burning bright, but it was also consuming everything around it, including the man at the center of the blaze. The price of fame. The early 1970s found Elvis Presley caught in a paradox. Professionally, he was at the peak of his commercial success, commanding enormous fees for his performances and selling out concert halls across America. The Las Vegas residencies brought in millions of dollars. His records, while not dominating the charts as they had in earlier eras, still sold respectably. He remained one of the most famous people on the planet, instantly recognizable, continuously influential. But personally, he was deteriorating in ways that should have been alarming to everyone around him. The prescription drug use that had begun innocently in Germany and escalated during the Hollywood years now spiraled into full-blown addiction. Dr. George Nichopoulos, known as Dr. Nick, became Elvis's personal physician in 1967, initially treating him for saddle pain and various other ailments. What began as a professional medical relationship evolved into something far more problematic. Polishing Dr. Nick prescribed medications with alarming frequency and in staggering quantities. In 1977 alone, the last year of Elvis's life, Nichopoulos wrote prescriptions for over 10,000 doses of various drugs, including powerful painkillers like Dilaudid and Demerol, sedatives like Quaaludes, tranquilizers like Valium, and numerous other substances. The medications were ostensibly for legitimate medical conditions, but the volume and variety suggested something beyond responsible medical care. Floring Jess never injected drugs and maintained a strong opposition to illegal street drugs. He genuinely believed that prescription medications, because they were prescribed by doctors and obtained legally, were fundamentally different from recreational drug use. This belief, reinforced by the doctors who continued to provide him with whatever he requested, allowed him to rationalize his increasing dependence while viewing himself as morally superior to drug users. The physical toll became increasingly visible. Elvis's weight, which had always fluctuated, now swung wildly as he struggled to control his appearance. He would diet obsessively before tours, using amphetamines and other stimulants to shed pounds quickly, then gain the weight back just as rapidly during breaks when he indulged in the rich southern food he had loved since childhood. His face became puffy, his body bloated. The lean, dangerous-looking performer of 1968 was gradually obscured by a man whose health was clearly failing. In 1973, he was hospitalized in a semi-comatose state. Doctors identified multiple serious conditions: jaundice, acute breathing difficulties, facial inflammation, abdominal distension, severe constipation, a bleeding stomach ulcer, and liver inflammation. Any one of these conditions should have been a wake-up call. Together, they painted a picture of a man whose body was breaking down under the assault of prescription drugs and poor health habits. 2 years later, in 1975, another hospitalization revealed even more problems: elevated blood pressure, high cholesterol, and megacolon, a serious condition where the large intestine expands abnormally, causing severe constipation and potentially releasing harmful toxins throughout the body. Elvis also developed emphysema, despite never having smoked cigarettes. His heart, subjected to years of stimulant abuse and poor health, was enlarged to twice its normal size. Clang, the pattern repeated itself with disturbing regularity. Elvis would suffer a health crisis, be hospitalized, receive warnings from doctors about the need to change his lifestyle, and then return to the same behaviors that had created the crisis. The touring schedule continued, the pills continued, the weight gain and crash diets continued. Nothing fundamentally changed because the system around Elvis, the people who depended on him financially, and the structure that Colonel Parker had created, required him to keep performing regardless of his physical condition. Uninterrupted, between tours, Elvis often isolated himself in his bedroom, a darkened sanctuary where he could escape the demands of being Elvis Presley. He would stay up all night, sleeping during the day, his circadian rhythms completely disrupted by prescription sleeping pills and stimulants. He required constant nursing care, someone to monitor his condition and administer medications. The image was heartbreaking. The king of rock and roll, one of the most famous people on earth, alone in his bedroom, dependent on nurses and pills, disconnected from the normal rhythms of life. His eating habits during these periods became erratic and extreme. He would binge on cheeseburgers, fried food, sweets, whatever he craved in the moment. Food was another addiction, another way to fill the emptiness that fame and success had somehow created rather than satisfied. The combination of overeating and prescription drug abuse created a toxic cycle that his body couldn't sustain. Perform. Through the declining health and increasing addiction, Elvis maintained his commitment to his audiences. The shows in the mid-1970s were uneven, sometimes brilliant, sometimes painful to watch. There were nights when Elvis was clearly impaired, forgetting lyrics, stumbling through performances, his speech slurred, and his movements uncertain. There were other nights when the old magic returned, when his voice was powerful and his stage presence commanding, when audiences could see glimpses of the genius that had always been there. The tragedy was that Elvis knew what was happening to him. He wasn't oblivious to his deterioration. He would make resolutions to change, to get healthy, to stop the pills. He would start diet and exercise programs, hire trainers, declare that things were going to be different. But the structure of his life, the demands placed on him, and the depth of his addiction made sustained change impossible. He would improve temporarily, then fall back into the same patterns. The people around him failed him in fundamental ways. Colonel Parker, concerned primarily with maintaining the revenue stream, pushed Elvis to keep touring even when it was obvious his health couldn't sustain the schedule. Dr. Nick, whether out of misguided compassion or professional negligence, continued to prescribe medications that Elvis clearly didn't need, in quantities that no responsible physician should have authorized. The members of Elvis's entourage, dependent on their jobs and unwilling to challenge him, enabled his worst behaviors while watching helplessly as he declined. His divorce from Priscilla in 1973, though amicable by divorce standards, removed one of the few people who might have intervened effectively. Priscilla had witnessed his drug use and health problems firsthand, and while she couldn't control his behavior during their marriage, her absence meant one less person who genuinely cared about his well-being and had the standing to confront him about it. Elvis dated other women after the divorce, including Linda Thompson, who stayed with him for several years and tried desperately to help him manage his health issues. But ultimately, no romantic partner could save him from himself. In November 1976, he began dating Ginger Alden, a younger woman who represented another attempt to find connection and escape the loneliness that haunted him, despite being constantly surrounded by people. By 1977, Elvis Presley was 42 years old and looked like a man 20 years older. His weight had ballooned to approximately 350 pounds. He was virtually non-functional between tours, requiring constant care. The prescription drug cocktail in his system included painkillers, sedatives, stimulants, and various other substances that no single body should have been expected to process. His enlarged heart, damaged liver, and other health problems meant he was living on borrowed time. Yet he kept performing. The tour schedule for 1977 was as demanding as ever. He had shows booked through the spring and summer, obligations that couldn't be cancelled without enormous financial consequences. On stage, dressed in elaborate jumpsuits that now had to be specially made to accommodate his weight, Elvis Presley tried to be the performer his audiences expected. Sometimes he succeeded. Often he didn't, but he never stopped trying. It turned out, was everything. Elvis Presley had achieved success beyond anything he could have imagined growing up in East Tupelo. He had revolutionized American music, become a global icon, made millions of dollars, and secured his place in history. But that success had demanded his health, his relationships, his peace of mind, and ultimately, his life. In August 1977, Elvis was preparing for another tour. 19 shows were scheduled, starting with a concert in Portland, Maine on August 17th. It would have been just another leg in the endless cycle of touring that had defined his life since 1969. But there wouldn't be another tour. Time, which had been running out for years, was about to expire completely. August 16th, 1977, the day the music stopped. The afternoon of August 16th, 1977, began like countless other afternoons at Graceland. Elvis was between tours, resting at home, preparing for the next series of shows that would take him across the country once again. The schedule was relentless, as always, but this was familiar territory now, the rhythm of his life since the comeback. Perform, travel, rest briefly at Graceland, then perform again. Elvis had been up most of the previous night, his disrupted sleep patterns the result of years of prescription sleeping pills and stimulants. He finally went to bed around 6 in the morning, but even then, sleep proved elusive. In the late morning, he woke and complained to Ginger Alden that he couldn't sleep. He told her he was going to the bathroom to read, something he often did, spending hours in the spacious bathroom adjoining the master suite, reading books or magazines while his body processed the various medications coursing through his system. Around 2:30 in the afternoon, Ginger woke up and realized Elvis hadn't returned to bed. She called out to him, but received no answer. She got up and walked to the bathroom, where she found him lying face down on the floor in his pajamas, unresponsive. His body was positioned as if he had fallen forward, possibly from the toilet. His face was darkened, his hands clenched. It was immediately clear that something was terribly wrong. Ginger screamed for help. Joe Esposito and Al Strada, members of Elvis's entourage, rushed into the room. They tried to revive him, but he was already cold to the touch. At 2:33 p.m., a call came into Memphis Fire Station number 29, reporting someone at 3754 Elvis Presley Boulevard having difficulty breathing. Ambulance Unit number 6 responded immediately, racing toward Graceland. The medics had been to Graceland before for various minor emergencies involving fans or staff. But when they arrived this time and were rushed upstairs to the bathroom, they found Elvis Presley lying on his back, surrounded by nearly a dozen people who had been attempting CPR. The medics quickly assessed the situation. Elvis's skin was dark blue, his body cold, his pupils unresponsive to light. They detected no pulse, no breathing, no vital signs. He appeared to have been dead for some time. Dr. George Nikopoulos, who had arrived shortly before the ambulance, jumped into the vehicle as the medics loaded Elvis onto a stretcher. His substantial weight required several men to lift him. As they navigated the stairs and hallways of Graceland, the surreal nature of the moment must have struck everyone involved. This was Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, being carried out of his mansion on a stretcher, clearly deceased or very close to it. Dr. Nick ordered the ambulance to Baptist Memorial Hospital rather than the closer Methodist South Hospital. The staff at Baptist was more discreet, better equipped to handle the media storm that would inevitably follow. The drive took 21 minutes, with Dr. Nick working frantically in the back of the ambulance alongside the medics, trying to produce some response from Elvis's unresponsive body. At the hospital, emergency room personnel made heroic efforts to revive him, attempting every resuscitation technique available in 1977. But it was hopeless. Elvis Aaron Presley was pronounced dead at 3:30 p.m., 42 years old, a bloated and broken version of the young man who had changed American music 23 years earlier. The official announcement sent shockwaves around the world. President Jimmy Carter issued a statement. Elvis permanently changed the face of American popular culture. Radio stations immediately switched to all Elvis programming. News broadcasts everywhere led with the story. Fans began gathering outside Graceland by the thousands, weeping, holding vigil, unable to process that Elvis Presley, who had seemed immortal despite his obvious health problems, was actually gone. The next day, Graceland opened its gates to allow the public to view Elvis's body, which lay in an open copper casket in the mansion's foyer. 80,000 people filed through in the oppressive August heat, many waiting for hours in line for a final glimpse of the king. The viewing had to be limited to just a few seconds per person to accommodate the enormous crowd. Some fainted from the heat and emotion. Others collapsed in grief. The outpouring of public mourning was unprecedented. But even as the world mourned, controversy was already brewing about the cause of death. Dr. Jerry Francisco, the medical examiner for Shelby County, Tennessee, held a press conference and announced that Elvis had died of cardiac arrhythmia, essentially a heart attack. The statement was made before the autopsy was complete and before toxicology results were available. Many suspected it was an attempt to protect Elvis's image and the Presley family's reputation. Wherever the toxicology report finally came back, weak story. Elvis's body contained high levels of multiple prescription drugs: codeine, morphine, quaaludes, Valium, Demerol, and several others. The combination of substances in his system would have been dangerous for anyone. For someone with Elvis's health problems, including an enlarged heart and severely compromised liver function, it was a deadly cocktail. Question became not whether drugs killed Elvis Presley, but whether it was an accidental overdose or simply the inevitable result of years of prescription drug abuse catching up with him. The official cause of death remained cardiac arrhythmia, which was technically true. His heart had stopped. But the underlying cause was clearly related to the pharmaceutical assault his body had endured for years. Intense scrutiny. ABC's 2020 program, hosted by Ted Koppel, investigated Elvis's death and concluded that a cover-up had occurred. They questioned why Dr. Nicopolis hadn't faced criminal charges. The Tennessee Medical Board eventually investigated, finding him guilty of improperly prescribing medications to 10 patients, including Elvis Presley and Jerry Lee Lewis. He was acquitted of criminal charges, but eventually lost his medical license in 1995. The circumstances of Elvis's death illuminated the toxic intersection of celebrity, addiction, and medical negligence. He had never sought illegal drugs, never considered himself an addict, because everything he took was prescribed by doctors. The system had failed him, enabling his addiction while maintaining the fiction that prescription drugs were fundamentally safe because they came from doctors rather than street dealers. On August 18, 1977, Elvis was buried at Forest Hill Cemetery in Memphis, next to his mother, Gladys. The funeral was attended by thousands, with over 3 million people lining the route of the funeral procession. Later, due to security concerns and attempted grave disturbances, both Elvis and Gladys were moved to Graceland, where they were buried in the meditation garden on the grounds of the estate. The death of Elvis Presley at 42 years old was a tragedy that felt both shocking and somehow inevitable. He had lived so intensely, burned so brightly, pushed his body beyond what any human frame could sustain. The drugs had killed him, but so had the fame, the pressure, the impossible expectations, the grinding schedule, the loneliness despite constant company, the void that all the success in the world couldn't fill. People around the world mourned not just the loss of an entertainer, but the loss of an era. Elvis represented something fundamental about post-war American culture: the possibility of transformation, the power of talent and charisma to transcend circumstances, the energy and rebellion of youth challenging the established order. His death felt like the end of innocence, the final proof that the dreams of the 1950s couldn't survive the harsh realities of the 1970s. But even in death, the controversy continued. Conspiracy theories emerged immediately, suggesting Elvis had faked his death, that he was still alive somewhere. The theories were absurd, driven by grief and denial rather than evidence. Billy Mann, one of Elvis's cousins, sold photographs of Elvis in his coffin to the National Enquirer for $18,000. The publication sold over 6 million copies, the biggest-selling issue in its history. Even dead, Elvis Presley remained a commodity, his image worth more than most people earn in a lifetime. The king was dead. The music had stopped. But the legend, it turned out, was just beginning. The Eternal King, Legacy Beyond Death. Graceland opened to the public in June 1982, 5 years after Elvis's death. Priscilla Presley, who had become the executor of his estate, recognized that the mansion could become a pilgrimage site, a place where fans could connect with Elvis's memory and, crucially, a revenue stream that would secure Lisa Marie's financial future. She was right on both counts. Graceland immediately became the second most visited home in the United States, after the White House, attracting over 500,000 visitors annually. Meaningless acumen Priscilla demonstrated in managing Elvis's legacy was remarkable. When she took control of Elvis Presley Enterprises in 1979, the estate was heavily in debt, its assets being consumed by upkeep costs and poor management. She transformed it into a highly profitable operation, merchandising Elvis's image and music, carefully controlling the brand, turning Graceland into a multi-million-dollar tourist attraction. By the time Lisa Marie inherited the estate, when she turned 25, it was worth over $100 million. Spinning commercial success of Elvis's legacy vindicated what Colonel Parker had always believed. Elvis Presley was more than an artist. He was a brand with enduring value. Between 1977 and 1981, 6 of Elvis's posthumously released singles became top 10 country hits. His music continued to sell steadily, introducing new generations to the revolutionary sound that had changed American culture. In 1986, Elvis was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as part of the institution's first class, alongside Chuck Berry, James Brown, Ray Charles, Sam Cooke, Fats Domino, and other pioneers. The honor recognized what was already obvious. Elvis Presley was one of the foundational figures in rock and roll, an artist whose influence shaped everything that came after. But Elvis didn't just influence rock and roll. He was eventually inducted into 7 different music halls of fame: rock and roll, 1986, country music, 1998, gospel music, 2001, rockabilly, 2007, Memphis music, 2012, National Rhythm and Blues, 2015, and Mississippi Musicians Hall of Fame. This unprecedented recognition across genre boundaries reflected what made Elvis unique. He wasn't just a rock singer or a country artist or a gospel performer. He was all of those things simultaneously, a musical polyglot who refused to be confined by the rigid categories that had always separated American music. The Grammy Awards, which often ignored rock and roll artists during Elvis's lifetime, eventually recognized his achievement with 3 competitive Grammy wins, all for gospel recordings. How Great Thou Art won Best Sacred Performance in 1967. The album of the same name won the same award in 1975. And He Touched Me won in 1973. Additionally, Elvis received the Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award in 1971 at age 36, one of the youngest recipients of that honor. His influence on other artists was profound and lasting. The Beatles, who revolutionized music in the 1960s, had all cited Elvis as a primary inspiration. John Lennon famously said, "Before Elvis, there was nothing." Bob Dylan wrote that hearing Elvis for the first time was like busting out of jail. Bruce Springsteen spoke about Elvis's music, giving him a way to dream beyond the limitations of his circumstances. Every rock artist who came after Elvis, whether they acknowledged it or not, walked through doors he had opened. But Elvis's legacy extended beyond music. He had broken racial barriers at a time when American society was rigidly segregated. By fusing black rhythm and blues with white country music, by crediting his black musical influences, by performing music that crossed color lines, Elvis helped prepare American culture for the civil rights movement and the eventual integration of popular music. He wasn't a civil rights activist in any political sense, but his musical integration represented a form of cultural activism, whether he intended it or not. His influence on American fashion and style was equally significant. The way Elvis dressed, moved, and styled his hair became templates for masculine rebellion. The sideburns, the pompadour, the flashy clothes, the open sexuality in his performances, all of it challenged the conservative norms of 1950s America and created space for future generations to express themselves more freely. Elvis's film career, despite its artistic limitations, made him one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. His 31 movies, whatever their quality, brought his image to audiences who might never have attended his concerts or bought his records. The global reach of Hollywood cinema made Elvis Presley an international phenomenon, recognizable in countries and cultures that knew nothing else about American rock and roll. The jumpsuits he wore during his Las Vegas years, designed by Bill Ballou, became iconic symbols of Elvis's later career. Museums around the world now display them as artifacts of cultural history. The elaborate designs, the rhinestones, the high collars and capes represented a kind of American royalty, a working-class kid from Mississippi transformed into genuine royalty through talent and charisma. Stories of Elvis's he had given away Cadillacs to strangers, paid medical bills for people he didn't know, supported charities quietly without seeking publicity. His final home, Graceland, stood as testimony to his success, but also to his fundamental Southern hospitality. The mansion was always open to friends and family, filled with people Elvis supported financially. He took care of his extended family, hired his childhood friends, maintained connections to his Mississippi roots, even as he became the most famous entertainer in the world. The contradictions in Elvis's character made him more human and more interesting than a perfect icon would have been. He was deeply religious, yet struggled with addiction. He was generous, yet controlled the people around him. He opposed drug use, yet destroyed himself with prescription medications. He challenged racial boundaries, yet never became politically active in civil rights. He was simultaneously humble about his talent and confident in his abilities. These contradictions didn't diminish him, they made him real. His relationship with his fans remained unique, even in death. The vigil at Graceland every August 16th, the anniversary of his death, draws thousands of people who gather to light candles and remember him. The devotion transcends normal fan appreciation. For many, Elvis represents something almost spiritual, a symbol of possibility, of transformation, of the power of art to change lives. Elvis's home, Graceland, was declared a National Historic Landmark in 2006, recognition that it represents something important in American cultural history. The mansion preserves Elvis's life in amber, the jungle room with its green shag carpet and tiki decorations, the television room with 3 TVs so Elvis could watch multiple programs simultaneously, the trophy room displaying his gold records and awards, the meditation garden where Elvis and his parents are buried. The sustained commercial success of Elvis's music in the decades after his death demonstrated that his appeal transcended nostalgia. New generations discovered his work through their parents or through cultural osmosis. In 2002, a remix of A Little Less Conversation by Junkie XL became an international hit, topping charts in over 20 countries. The song's success introduced Elvis to young audiences who weren't born until years after his death. Television specials, documentaries, and biopics have continued to explore Elvis's life and legacy. The 2022 film Elvis, directed by Baz Luhrmann and starring Austin Butler, grossed over $250 million worldwide and introduced Elvis's story to yet another generation. The film's success demonstrated that interest in Elvis Presley remained strong 45 years after his death. But perhaps the most profound aspect of Elvis's legacy is what he represented to the American imagination. He was the ultimate embodiment of the American dream, a poor boy from Mississippi who became the most famous entertainer in the world through talent, hard work, and charisma. His story validated the belief that in America you could transcend your circumstances, that talent and determination could overcome poverty and lack of advantages. The fact that his dream ended tragically, that success couldn't protect him from addiction and early death, added complexity to the narrative without negating its power. Elvis proved that you could make it, but he also demonstrated that making it wasn't enough, that success couldn't fill all the voids in the human heart, that fame carried costs that no one could fully anticipate. Checkpoint's sales still sold over 500 million records worldwide, more than any solo artist in history. He had 149 songs in the Billboard Hot 100, the most for any artist. He spent more weeks at #1 than any other solo artist. The statistics are staggering, but they don't capture what made Elvis special. Numbers can quantify success, but they can't measure cultural impact, artistic influence, or the way a voice and a performance style can change how an entire society thinks about music and youth and rebellion. His voice, that remarkable instrument that could shift from tender vulnerability to raw power within a single phrase, established the template for rock and roll vocals. His performance style, that combination of movements and energy and sexual confidence, showed future performers what was possible on stage. His willingness to blend genres, to refuse categorization, to take from black and white musical traditions and create something new, demonstrated artistic courage that opened doors for everyone who followed. When people say there will never be another Elvis, they're acknowledging something fundamental. The cultural moment that allowed Elvis to emerge was unique. The rigid racial boundaries in 1950s America created the tension that his musical fusion could explode. The emergence of teenagers as a distinct consumer group with their own tastes created the audience that Elvis could speak to. The development of television as a mass medium provided the platform for Elvis to become a national and then global phenomenon almost instantly. All of those factors converged at the exact moment when a young man from Tupelo, Mississippi, walked into Sam Phillips's studio and accidentally invented rock and roll. The combination of talent, timing, and cultural forces was unrepeatable. Elvis wasn't just the right person at the right time, he was the only person who could have done what he did, when he did it, how he did it. The King lives on. In the end, Elvis Aaron Presley's story is not primarily about music, though the music was extraordinary. It's not primarily about fame, though he achieved fame beyond anything he could have imagined. It's not even primarily about success, though he succeeded beyond the wildest dreams of that poor boy in Tupelo. Elvis's story is about transformation and transcendence, about the power of art to break boundaries and change cultures, about what happens when raw talent meets desperate ambition, about the price we pay for our dreams and the legacy we leave when those dreams consume us. He was born in poverty, so grinding it seemed inescapable, in a place where opportunity was scarce and hope was a luxury. The odds against him were astronomical. Millions of young people in Depression-era America had dreams of escaping their circumstances. almost none of them made it. But Elvis Presley, carrying the spirit of his stillborn twin and the hopes of his struggling parents, refused to accept that poverty would define his entire life. He found salvation in music, in the gospel songs that filled the Pentecostal church, in the blues that poured from the black community around him, in the country music that told stories of hardship and heartbreak. He absorbed all of it, filtered it through his own sensibility, and created something revolutionary. On July 5, 1954, in a small Memphis recording studio, Elvis Presley fused black and white musical traditions in a way that had never been done before, and in doing so, he planted the seed of rock and roll. The explosion that followed was inevitable once the spark was lit. Television gave him the platform to reach millions. His natural charisma and controversial performance style made him impossible to ignore. Within 2 years, he had gone from truck driver to the most famous entertainer in America. He had kept his promise to his parents. He had bought them the Cadillac and the house. He had lifted them out of poverty. He had become somebody. The draft interrupted his momentum, but couldn't stop it. He served his country with honor, proving that fame didn't exempt him from duty, that underneath the phenomenon was a regular young man who believed in responsibility. When he returned from the army, he found his way back, though the path led through years of artistic compromise in Hollywood before the 1968 comeback special reminded the world why Elvis Presley mattered. The later years, the addiction and the declining health and the tragic death at 42 don't diminish what he achieved. They make him human. They remind us that talent and success don't protect us from our demons, that fame can't fill the holes in our hearts, that we're all vulnerable to the substances and behaviors that promise relief but deliver destruction. Elvis's death was a tragedy, but his life was a triumph. From the Shotgun House in East Tupelo to Graceland in Memphis, from nobody to the king of rock and roll, he traveled. A distance that measured not just in miles, but in cultural transformation. He changed American music. He influenced American culture. He broke racial barriers and challenged social norms. He showed that a working-class kid with nothing but talent and determination could reach the absolute pinnacle of success. His voice still echoes through American music. Every rock and roll singer who followed walked paths he cleared. Every performer who understood that music was about more than sound, that it was about movement and energy and connection with the audience, learned from Elvis Presley. He made rock and roll dangerous and exciting and sexy and rebellious. He made it matter. The mansion in Memphis remains a pilgrimage site, drawing hundreds of thousands of visitors every year who want to connect with his memory. The recordings remain in print, still selling, still influencing new artists. The jumpsuits are displayed in museums. The movies, despite their limitations, continue to be watched. The legend grows rather than fading, each generation discovering Elvis and understanding why he was revolutionary. In the end, Elvis Presley proved that transformation is possible, that circumstances don't determine destiny, that a voice and a vision can change the world. He paid a terrible price for his success, but he never stopped trying to give his audiences everything he had. Even when his body was failing and the pills were destroying him, even when he could barely stand on stage, he kept performing because that's who he was. He was a performer, and performing was how he connected with the world. The boy who sang in the Pentecostal church in Tupelo, who stood on a chair to reach the microphone at the talent contest, who walked into Sam Phillips's studio hoping to be heard, became the king of rock and roll. He revolutionized music, transformed culture, and lived a life that captured the American imagination like few others in history. Elvis Aaron Presley is gone, but he will never be forgotten. His music survives, his influence endures, his legend grows. The king is dead, but the king lives on. In every rock and roll song, in every performance that breaks boundaries, in every young person who believes that talent and determination can overcome any obstacle. Accompany Live the King.